Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of May of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates are coming from Kharkiv direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation with the purpose to create a buffer zone between Belgorod region and Kharkiv area. This is necessary for the Russians. This is the vital question for the Russians because during the previous, for example, 24 hours, the Ukrainians, conducted massive missile strike over the entire Belgorod region, and as a result of another attack, almost half of the building was destroyed till ruins with a significant number of casualties. So the thing is that this is the vital question for the Russians if they want to, let's say, keep their territory in the safe place. So that's why they need to push, they need to attack, and this is exactly what they're doing right now. When talking about the progress on the ground, as you can see, we have significant number of icons, geolocations, every single one of them means something. But if we summarize everything and if we follow according to the Ministry of Defense report, the Russians stated that units of the several group of forces advanced to the death of the armed forces of Ukraine defenses and established complete control over 4 villages: Gatishne, Krasnohorivka, Maragovets and Alenikovo. So 4 settlements were captured by the Russians. Let's return back on map. According to the Russians, this village was captured, and for example, we also received the first geolocated video confirmation of the presence of the Russian forces inside of the village in the vicinity of the main, let's say board that with the title of the village. Also, according to the Russians, they established complete control over 3 more villages: the Maragovets, Alenikovo, and the village by the name of Krasnohorivka. So these 3 villages. One important thing that I would like to point your attention, if you remember yesterday we were talking about the official Telegram channel of the Group of Forces North or Sever, and yesterday in the evening reports, not even in the evening reports, but during the day, the official Telegram channel stated that these 4 settlements, Krasnohorivka, Maragovets and Alenikovo and Gatishina, this one, were already captured by the Russians. So when talking about the previous 24 hours, starting of the yesterday evening, or let's say 5 p.m. till today, let's say 8 p.m. of the local time of the 12th of May, the Russians haven't managed to establish complete control even over a single village. What does it mean? First of all, that means that it doesn't mean that the Russians stopped or that the Russians were slowed down by the Ukrainians or something like this. Not. The thing is that during the previous 2 days, the first and the second day, the Russians were, let's say, maintaining the gray zone, the area that wasn't well fortified by the Ukrainians due to the problems with logistic and basically with impossibility of, let's say, fortifying and let's say creation a defense belt along the border, because the Russians were too close and the Russians would destroy even a single, let's say, engineering equipment that is heading towards the border. So the Russians bypassed the gray zone, established complete control over a significant number of the villages, and by the 12th of May, by the 3rd day of offensive Kharkiv operation, the Russians reached the main and the first defense belt. So if we compare the situation with, let's say, Zaporozhye direction, basically the Russians for 3 days of offensive operation managed to reach Rabotino. The Ukrainians during the Zaporozhye offensive operation, greatest Ukrainian offensive operation, spent around a month to get the first defense belt, the first town Rabotino, and lost around 40,000 soldiers. The Ukrainians managed to complete the same thing in 3 days and with entire 50,000 soldiers on the line of combat contact. Of course, the losses from the Russian side are much lower in comparison with the Ukrainians. So this is the reason we haven't received any updates about further Russian progress, about further more captured villages and towns. So let's talk what is the first defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine. When talking about the western flank, this one, there are 3 towns that is the first defense belt. This is the town by the name of Gluboka, Lukantsy, and Neskuchne, and the Russians reached all of these towns. When talking about Gluboka, we start receiving updates yesterday that the Russians, that the clashes, start taking place inside of the village, that the Russians were attacking this territory. But as we discussed in the previous update, most likely the Russians were talking about the northern part of the village that located on the Russian side of a small river in the area, and we're talking about farms. Most likely the farms were captured. When talking about the this residential part, most likely this territory is still under complete Ukrainian control. Look and see, the Russians reached this area just today because we got the first geolocations confirming that the Russians are moving further to this village. We have the Ukrainians who were, let's say, filming the well-fortified areas. You can see the Ukrainian defense belt was abandoned by the Ukrainians without even resistance, and the Ukrainian drone was flying here. So the Russians, based on that video, was moving something like this, and most likely this night the Russians will make the first attempts to attack the village itself. The third town in this defense belt is the village by the name of Niskuchne. We haven't received any updates neither from the Minister of Defense or the official Telegram channels of several group of forces, just from the sources on the ground and different military experts and different mappers, that this territory was captured by the Russians as well. The Russians established complete control over Zelyone, over fields, and managed to connect two offensive roads between Borisovka and Zelyone. Once again, without any geolocated confirmation. So this is also the area where the Russians are trying to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to enter from Sereda through Zelyone in direction of Niskuchne. Once again, if the Russians are able to establish control even over single town, any town on this direction, this will lead to complete collapse of this defense belt. So this is the reason why the Russians will be forced to spend some time. They will have to waste maybe 1, 2, or 3 days. Maybe some of these villages will be bypassed very fast. Maybe some of them the Russians will be forced to spend a week or even more. Currently, nobody knows this for sure. The Ukrainians rely on their soldiers. The Russians rely on their soldiers. Commanders try to calculate the tactics, they conduct successful operations, and this is exactly what is happening right now in the direction. But when talking about the Russians, of course, they use everything they have. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces behind the first defense belt, so the main area of concentration of forces that you can use to send additional reserves, reinforcements, to evacuate wounded from the direction. The Russians published the video of how they were bombing and attacking the main supply road between Liptsi and the village by the name of Gluboke. You can see, so the Russians attacked the main defense belt. And today the Ukrainians special forces start spreading the information if the Russians break through the first defense belt, if the Russians enter Gluboke or Lukansi or Niskuchne, then Ukrainians will blow up the dam, this dam with the purpose to flood the area in this to the north of Liptsi and to slow down the Russians. So it's obviously going to take place not today but tomorrow, as soon as the Russians break through the first defense belt. Also, we got a lot of videos of counter-artillery duels, of casualties among the Ukrainian armored vehicles, artillery systems. We see the Ukrainians are sending more and more forces on the direction. Yesterday we talked about one batch of the brigades that were operating on the direction. Today we got additional updates of new forces that were sent by the Ukrainians. According to different channels, official channels of different brigades, the sources reported that currently the Ukrainian commanders are trying to take, let's say, small battalions, small small group of forces from every single brigade all over the entire Ukraine and to send them to Kharkiv direction, because they can't tell, let's say, fully blooded brigade from this or that direction, because in this case they're going to be a very big hole in defense. So that's why they're trying to take small squads, small groups from every single brigade, and then the Ukrainian commanders are sending them to the line of combat contact. Furthermore, we got a very interesting piece of news, and the thing is that the Ukrainian head of the main Directorate of Intelligence, Budanov, arrived in Kharkiv. It's very difficult to understand the reason why he arrived in Kharkiv. Some sources are saying that he is going to be responsible for Kharkiv defense operation. Maybe he will replace, after successful, if the operation is going to be successful, Syrsky himself. Other sources are saying that Budanov arrived in Kharkiv with the purpose to stabilize the situation among his soldiers, because you know that there is like a regular Ukrainian army, but there is like forces like Kraken. I believe you're familiar with this title, or if you remember, proxy Ukrainian forces like RDK, Free Russian Regiment, and many other, let's say, proxy forces whose main purpose and who was operating on the territory of Russian Federation during the previous, let's say, months, if you remember those Ukrainian attempts to cross the border. And these groups are, let's say, responsible in front of this person, so they're he is in charge of these groups. And according to information we have, And the Russians managed to break through and to capture significant number of square kilometers along the border, along the territory that was under the responsibility of those proxy groups and those special forces, because those special forces abandoned their positions without showing any resistance to the Russians. So basically he arrived in this area to stabilize the line between his soldiers. Maybe that's like one of the opinions. But the Ukrainians are saying like this. They're saying that what is happening, where is the proxy forces, their main responsibility was to hold the border, not to allow the Russians to break through, and now we see complete collapse of defense. So many statements from many Ukrainian brigades about this situation. And the same story we got from the city of Vovchansk. The Ukrainian police officer who was moving in the northern part of Vovchansk was talking that they're leaving the town at the last wave, their last one who is evacuating from the northern part of Vovchansk. The first groups who left Vovchansk, who abandoned Vovchansk, were those proxy forces and those special forces of let's say main Directorate of Intelligence that is under control of Budanov. So according to lots of reports, lots of Ukrainian forces have already abandoned their positions. The Russians stated about significant number of prisoners of war, a lot of captured Ukrainians who don't want to fight, who surrendered as soon as they see the Russian tank heading on their positions. So we've covered the situation on the western flank. Now let's move to the eastern flank in direction of Vovchansk. The Russians also managed to bypass the fields and to reach the first defense belt. But when talking about Vovchansk, there are 4 main areas of defense that Ukrainians are trying to fight for and not to allow the Russians to break through them. Let's say Vovchansk is the central, let's say, chain of defense. The western chain of defense of Vovchansk direction is 2 villages, Staritsa and Bugruvatka. And according to information we have, according to different videos and photos that we received from the area, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, we have enough of evidence that confirms that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to break through, to bypass the fields between Russian border and this, let's say, defense belt without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to enter the northwestern part of Staritsa and to dig in deeper in the village, and most likely tomorrow, or maybe this night, or maybe the Russians have already launched an offensive operation with the purpose to break through this part of, let's say, defense chain in the vicinity of Vovchansk. So there are very heavy clashes, but without, let's say, any updates that the Russians entered. Just it's our projections and our speculations, because it's like let's say logical development of the situation. Now we're moving to the eastern flank of Vovchansk chain, defense chain. We have lots of towns and villages, and there are very small towns and villages. There are towns by the name of Tikhe, Vovchansky Hutory, Pokolyane, and Zybina. And according to information we have, according to analysis that was provided by different military experts, the Russians managed to break through this defense belt and already established complete control over at least 2 villages in the area. The village by the name of Tikhe was captured by the Russians, and according to Russian sources, the village by the name of Zybina was also captured by the Russians. I'm adding just white arrows because there were no official statement, neither from the Ministry of Defense, neither from different, let's say, group of forces. It's just like reports from the ground, from different mappers and many other things. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians established complete control over the intersection of roads that was heading to Vovchansky Hutory. So if we summarize everything, we see that the Russians are more or less successful in this direction, and most likely tomorrow the Russians will try to improve their positions and to answer Vovchansky Hutory and to answer the village by the name of Pokolyane, with the purpose to completely collapse the, let's say, eastern defense belt of the Vovchansk defense chain, which will allow the Russians to establish complete control over Vovchansk as well. When talking about Vovchansk as well, we got a lot of very interesting updates, and as we discussed, the first one is that there is like evacuation process from the northern part. And important thing for your understanding about Vovchansk: Vovchansk is splitted in 2 parts, and the town is splitted by the river by the name of Vovcha. This is the river, and the river is, you can see, split the town in 2 parts. And we understand that the northern part most likely will be captured by the Russians very fast, maybe even during the upcoming night. But when talking about the southern part, obviously this is going to be very tough and very difficult operation, because the Russians will be forced to cross the river or to find any other solution how to capture the territory. And this is exactly why the Russians are trying to attack on the eastern flank, because it is much more easier to, let's say, to cross the river Vovcha to enter this part and from this side of Vovcha river than in the future to attack the Ukrainians in Vovchansk from the east. So this is like exactly what the Russians are planning to implement. So Vovchansk itself, two defense belts, the northern one and the southern one. The northern probably will fall very soon, because today, during the day, we got a lot of updates that the Russians have already entered at least two areas of the northern defense belt. The Russians entered the airfield, and this area is already in the Russian control, and the Russians entered the first buildings and the first, let's say, streets inside of northern Vovchansk. So this is the situation of the direction. We got the first videos confirming the damage that the Russians did during the previous days, and as you can see, for now everything is more or less stable. We are not seeing the pictures of Chasiv Yar or Bakhmut when most of the buildings were already reduced to ruins. We see that the town more or less fresh, of course, a lot of explosions, a lot of consequences of strikes, but anyway, due to the fact that the Russians are acting very fast, most of the buildings most likely the Russians will be able to save, not to allow the destructions of the town completely, because the Russians need the town, they need the population, because they will move further to the south and they need to have some infrastructure under their legs, under their positions. When talking about the southern part of Vovchansk, the main defense belt, the Russian sources published the video that the southern part of Vovchansk was completely covered with fire as a result of Russian strikes, multiple launch rocket strikes, flamethrower strikes, so the southern part is under very heavy pressure. Furthermore, we got reports that Ukrainians start the purges among the officers and commanders of 125th Territory Brigade, because they abandoned and left their positions under the Russian pressure without showing any resistance to the Russians. The sources reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted few counterattacks on the Russian positions in Gatishina, but the Ukrainians were attacking without any supply, any support, any artillery support, any FPV drone support, and the Ukrainians during those counterattacks, lost around 300 soldiers. This statement was made after another statement that they haven't added on map, because first the sources reported that the Ukrainian soldiers were, let's say, sticked to the river, Vovcha river. So as you can see, there is a river, and the Ukrainians were in Gatishina. And as a result of under the Russian pressure, the Russians were attacking to Gatishina, and there were Ukrainian soldiers who were retreating under the Russian pressure. And at some point, the Ukrainian soldiers were sticked to the river Vovcha and was under very heavy fire. And they requested for evacuation, and those were the forces of Kraken, those were the forces of those pro-Ukrainian proxies, and the Ukrainian commanders denied any evacuation, ordering them to fight till the last. And after that, the Ukrainians realized that there is no chances for evacuation, decided to find another way, basically to break through the encirclement, and they start counterattack, and they were destroyed. Once again, up to 300 soldiers the Ukrainians lost during those, let's say, clashes along Vovcha river. So as you can see, the situation is very critical. Furthermore, most of Ukrainian armored vehicles currently is hidden among the forest, and it's the only way how to, let's say, hide the Ukrainian tanks, personnel, the Ukrainian armored vehicles, artillery systems from the Russian view, from the Russian drones. The Russians understand this everything clearly, so that's why the Russians are bombing and pummeling this area heavily with everything they have, with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to leave the forest and to move their vehicles under the open air, under the open space, where of course all these things will be destroyed automatically and very fast. So this is the situation. Let's summarize once again. The Russians reached the first defense belt. The first defense belt, if we compare the situation with Zaporozhye, it's like the Ukrainians reached Robotyne. The Ukrainians spent a month and lost around 40,000 soldiers. The Russians spent 3 days and of course lost much more, less in comparison with the Ukrainians. And now everything defends, and the next few days are going to be vital and decisive for the Ukrainians. The Russians have significant benefits, and the biggest benefits, valuable benefit the Russians managed to achieve is that they bypassed the fields just for 1 day and for 2 days, and the Ukrainians haven't managed to redeploy the reinforcement from other directions. This is the most important. The Russians basically have few more days before the Ukrainians will be able to collect a critical mass. So for the next few days, the Russians need to break through at least 2 or 3 towns that we have already discussed on the western flank, either on the eastern flank. This will allow the Russians to continue moving further to the south, and the Ukrainians from this moment will not be able to do anything with the Russian defense belt. So this is like decisive days. Maybe this night upcoming is decisive and vital for both sides. And now exactly during the next 6, maybe 12 hours, everything will be resolved and will, let's say, establish the base for further development of the situation on this direction. Now let's move further to other important things, and very interesting details and very important updates are coming from Chasiv Yar direction, where we got significant number of details, and the most important is that the Russians answered the Chasiv Yar from the northeastern part. We have significant number of geolocations. Currently the Russians are pushing this way, trying to, let's say, cut and split this area in 2 parts, and the Russians are trying to get to this, first of all, to this area, to improve their positions and to get as close as possible to Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. And we have a lot of geolocations published by the Ukrainians of how FPV drones were flying above area and dropping the grenades on the Russians. From the other side, from the Russian side, we see significant number of geolocations of how the Russians were pummeling the southern part, let's say the area that Ukrainians use for redeployment of forces, some supply roads with the TOS flamethrower systems, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to bring additional reinforcements, let's say from the southern part of eastern Chasiv Yar to the northern part. So they're trying to ease the movements of the Russians as much as possible. When talking about Ivanovska, today we got different mappers who have already updated their maps, showing additional Russian progress to the west of Ivanovska. As you can see, the Russians improved their foothold significantly. Now the Russians, according to different mappers, control around 2 kilometers of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, and the most important, the Russians control the most important part of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, because they have a ground area where they can cross canal and to move further on the territory that is under Ukraine control. For now, according to the sources, the Russians are not moving further to the west, because the Russians are waiting when the northern group of forces will finish their operation. We are talking about this one. So as soon as the Russians on the northern direction reach Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, this part, then the southern part will begin their own operation, their further operation to the west, to the south, or to the north, or whatever. So for now, this one operation is on hold until the northern operation finish. But until all these things, the Russians are trying to improve their positions further to the south. Let's say to increase the control, the length of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal that is under Russian control. So the next few days, the let's say separate Russian troopers will try to move further to the south, also with the purpose to encircle Klishchiivka and to force the Ukrainians to abandon their positions from Klishchiivka as well, because most likely this is exactly what is going to happen, because the less Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal the Ukrainian controls, the more chances for the Russians to finish this battle very fast. Now we are moving further to Avdiivka direction, where we also got significant number of details. Different mappers confirmed that in either the Russians, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, neutral, that the Russians cleared and established complete control over the fields between Novoalexandrovka, Arkhangelska, and Ocheretina. So to summarize everything, the Russians cleared the trenches, cleared the fortifications, and the Russians prepared the foothold for further offensive operation in direction of Kalinovo. Furthermore, we start receiving the first geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces to the south of Kalinovo in this area, which confirms that the Russians began the clearing operation and preparation for further offensive. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Krasnohorivka, where we also got significant number of details. According to different mappers, very reliable mappers, the Russians managed to the Ukrainian defense belt in the eastern Krasnohorivka collapsed under the Russian pressure. These trenches that Ukrainians have been building since the 2014, which were one of the most powerful defense belt ever, as Avdiivka collapsed and fell under the Russian pressure without even Russian attacks, because the Ukrainians, when they had time, they evacuated from this area and basically they abandoned their positions and retreat towards the northern and the northwestern part of Krasnohorivka. So we, as understand, the Russians were trying to encircle the Ukrainians, were trying to create a cauldron, but they haven't managed to complete the cauldron because the Ukrainians currently they managed to get some experience and skills since the beginning of the special military operation. Now it's not so easy to encircle the Ukrainians. They at least, when talking about this direction, there are, let's say, the forces of 59s and 46 air mobile brigades. On this video, for example, we can see that the Russians are using moto assault troopers massively, motorcycles. They're very mobile, flexible, and this is another problem for the Ukrainians that they can't understand how to work with and how to handle with. Furthermore, we got reports about additional Russian progress in Georgievka. When talking about South Donetsk direction, nothing important from Konstantinovka. Just the important thing that I believe we need to discuss is that the Russians activated their movements in direction from Vladimirovka, and the fields were captured by the Russians. You may notice that regarding the fact that currently the most important direction is Kharkiv, when talking about the losses in the Ministry of Defense report, there is the lowest losses exactly on Kharkiv direction. It's very weird and strange, but the less losses is there. The minimal level of losses exactly on the Kharkiv direction. When talking, for example, Avdiivka direction or the forces, the group of forces center, the level of losses is more than 400 soldiers. When talking about the group of forces Yug or the south, the level of losses in their area of responsibility from the Ukrainian side is around 600 soldiers. So it's very strange that the main direction of attack is Kharkiv, but the biggest losses the Ukrainians have on every single other direction but not Kharkiv. And the thing is, as we discussed, the Ukrainians decided to take small groups of every single brigade and to send them to Kharkiv, which led to the situation with lots of holes in Ukrainian defense belt all over the line of combat contact. And that situation led to a significant number of the breakthroughs all over the line of combat contact. Очеретина, Krasnohorivka, Novomikhailivka, Vladimirovka. Today we got even reports that the forces who were responsible for defense of Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka, Paraskovivka, 79th Air Assault Brigade was also, some parts of that brigade were also sent to Kharkiv. And most likely the 72nd also was redeployed some parts to Kharkiv. And that led to the situation that the Ukrainians were forced to abandon from some positions. So I don't understand the tactics of Syrsky, but maybe he knows better what's he doing. We'll see. Урожайная Старомайорska. After very heavy clashes on the southern outskirts of the villages, we start receiving any updates, and the Russians began the pummeling of the area since the beginning. Lots of FAPs, lots of artillery strikes without any changes on the ground. The same story we have about Robotina. After, let's say, a few days of clashes, the Russians turned back to the tactics of bombing. When talking Kherson, after the beginning of Kharkiv operation, we see complete absence of any movements from the Ukrainian side. We were expecting that Ukrainians would try to attack the Russians in Kherson when the Russians start Kharkiv operation, but most likely the Ukrainians didn't expect that Kharkiv operation is going to be so powerful and so fast. So that's why instead of attacking the Russians in Kherson, Zelensky decided to send the soldiers who can carry ammo and weapon to Kharkiv with the purpose to stabilize the situation. Just imagine yourself how difficult the situation is. And the thing is that, and more reports we received during the evening, and tomorrow in the morning we'll discuss them in details, that more and more sources are saying that Kharkiv offensive operation wasn't the primary target of the Russians. And during the next week we're going to see the most important, the most powerful and primary attack of Russian forces. And where exactly this attack is going to take place, nobody knows, and this is going to be very interesting. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.